Okay, I have the top of the hour, so I'm going to get started. We have, I think 15 people have joined. Let me check, 16. Welcome to all of you. Let me tell you a little bit of background on this. First of all, Jarek has been asking me to do this session at SLO symposiums for several years now. If you've sat through my session before, I will not be offended if you leave this one and join a different session. I noticed there's another session on rubrics that I think is going to be probably a lot of the same information, just presented from a different slant. The one thing I'm adding this year is at the end, I'm going to add some practical suggestions for creating equitable rubrics. Since there's only 17 of us now, I'm going to run through these slides because I've got about 30 and I want to make sure I cover all of them in the hour, and then open it up at the end for your ideas, questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes, everything like that. If you think of a question, go ahead and post it in chat. And then when I go through the slides, the first thing I'll do is go look through chat and answer questions that have been posted there. But since it's only up to 18, if anybody at that point wants to, unmute their microphone and ask a question, that's fine too. Also, if you want to take a screenshot or a photo of any slide, that's fine. I'm going to send a PDF of the slides to Jarek tomorrow, so he should be able to make them available to anybody who wants them. The three things that we're going to cover are: what is a rubric, 4 steps to creating great rubrics, and then those practical suggestions for equitable rubrics. Let me give you a little bit of history to start. I was asked to write a book chapter on rubric development a few years ago. And I'm embarrassed to say that before that, I had never truly reviewed the literature on developing rubrics. So if I'm writing a book chapter, of course, I reviewed the literature, and there's quite a bit more in K-12 education than in higher education. It rocked my world, what I learned, so much so that for a while I did sessions like this, but I titled them "Everything I Thought I Knew About Rubrics Was Wrong." Really, really blew my mind. So I don't know if I'm going to blow your mind or you're going to come away and say, yeah, I've been doing that already, but I hope you'll pick up at least a few ideas. The reason I want to start with what is a rubric is one of the first things I learned is there is no consensus on what is a rubric. So let me see if I can move to the next slide. There we go. The only consensus that I heard from just about all the experts is that a rubric is a set of guidelines for evaluating student work. And a rubric should be clear to students and to your colleagues. It should be fair, which ties in really neatly with this conference theme of equity. It should let you evaluate student work consistently, and it should force you to focus on what's important. What are the most important things you're looking for in student work? There should be some kind of a description or list of the things that you're looking for, and there should also be some articulation about what is great work, what is adequate work, and what is inadequate work. But beyond that, there's a lot of difference of opinion on what we can call a rubric. And let me run through 4 formats. The simplest one is a checklist, which we don't use a whole lot in higher ed. You see it more in elementary school, but you'll see there's one here for safe culinary practices. Where I see checklists being used is when there's matters of health and safety, where there's nothing, if you're not completely safe, you're not safe. If you're partly safe, that's not safe. So in health, medicine, and safety issues, engineering, for example, if you don't build the bridge, every part of it correctly, it could collapse. So that's where I see checklists being used. Second format that I've seen a lot of is a rating scale. This is one that I created myself with a course that I taught, where I really like to use group work. But the first time I tried group work, it was a disaster. I had one group, they were at each other's throats. So the way that I solved that problem was to tell everybody the next time every course I've taught since, that I'm going to put you in groups. At the end of the course, your group mates are going to evaluate you on how good a group member you were, and that's going to be 5% of your final grade. Now, between you and me, nobody, even in grad school, has figured out that 5% of your grade does not change anybody's grade. Trust me, I've done the math, but it worked more as a classroom management device, and it worked beautifully. But you can see here, it's like a checklist. The format is like a checklist, only there's a rating scale tacked onto it. I really like these for relatively minor assignments because these are so easy to come up with. You just write a list of the things you're looking for, tack on a rating scale, and you're done. And it does give some feedback to students. They know which things they think you're doing, you think they're doing well, and where you think they could improve. Not a lot of specific information on exactly why they didn't get a great rating, but it certainly meets a lot of the traits of a rubric. Then, and I know you will not be able to read the fine print on this, and that's okay. I'm doing this to show you the format. One of the courses that I've taught is first year writing, and this is the rubric that I used to assess. I used it to grade students, but I've seen very similar rubrics used to assess gen ed learning outcomes in written communication. This is like a rating scale, only instead of the little bubbles on the previous slide, now we have descriptions in all the boxes. This, I learned, is called an analytic rubric. And this is generally considered to be the gold standard of rubric formats, because with all those little boxes, instead of checking a bubble, you mark which box applies to the student assignment. This, if you have good, clear descriptions in the boxes, this really makes a rubric that's fair and consistent. You can have two different faculty members using the same rubric, and if the boxes are really clear, their rubric scores should be reasonably similar. The problem with this one is this takes a lot of time to develop and a lot of work. I like to say that I taught writing over 2 semesters, and in the 2 semesters, I went through 7 versions of this rubric, and I was only arguing with myself. It's a lot more work when you're working with a group of faculty to come up with it. So I like to reserve this format for the really big, important assignments, the capstone assignments, the signature assignments, the ones where you want everybody to be consistent and you want to be really clear. One of the things that I've also learned is a good practice, and this is a big part of being equitable, is when you give students the assignment, you give them the rubric with the assignment. What I found, and lots of other faculty have found this, you'll always have some students that want to get an A or a B. They want to do whatever they need to do to get an A or a B. And if it's laid out for them, they will at least try to do what you have in the A and B column. That makes their work better. And we all know that A work is much faster and easier to evaluate or grade than C work. So it's less work for us. They learn more. It's win-win all around. Then there's one other format, and somebody asked about helping people get started with rubrics that have no experience with them. And this is the format I suggest. I call this a structured observation guide. I ran into one other person who came up with the same format. They had a different name for it. This is basically a rubric without the rating scale. This is a qualitative rubric. It still lists the things you're looking for, but instead of having the rating scale, there's just a space to write comments. This is a perfectly good evaluation tool if you're willing to do a qualitative evaluation rather than a quantitative evaluation. This one here I came up with, I was working with some faculty, theater faculty, that had a capstone assignment that all students in the program had to produce a 1-act play. And before I worked with them, they just gave everybody in the audience a piece of blank paper to write down comments. Well, that's not consistent. It's not fair. This at least gets everybody looking at the same 7 things and writing comments on all 7 things. So if you're getting started with people who have never used rubrics, are unfamiliar with them, I think this is a great way to start taking baby steps. first, however they're evaluating now, ask them, go through their comments, go through whatever documentation they have, and look for common themes. Use them to make this kind of a list and say, don't worry about the fancy rubric right now. Let's just do this qualitative approach. Just write comments, but just write them on these categories. I find this is especially effective with faculty in the arts and humanities who may not be comfortable with numbers, but they're very comfortable giving feedback to their students. So good way to do that. And then if they feel comfortable, you can talk about a more quantitative rubric later. But this is systematic, even though it is qualitative rather than quantitative. So this is a version of a good practice rubric. So which of these 4 formats is a rubric? There are some people that say only the analytic rubric should be called a rubric and the others should be called reading scales or checklists or structured observation guides. Other experts said all of these meet that definition of a rubric that I showed you on the first slide. What I've learned is I'm not getting into that discussion anymore. I call an analytic rubric, and there's no point in getting into the argument because we don't have a consensus on which of these can be called a rubric and which can't. So with that, let me move into the 4 steps to creating a great analytic rubric, because as I said, that's the hardest one. If you can create an analytic rubric, you can create the others. The others are a piece of cake. And here are the 4 steps. You first want to list in the left column the traits of the learning outcomes that are being assessed with whatever you're looking at. The second step is to label the performance levels across the top. The third step, and the hardest one, is filling in all the boxes. And then the last step, interestingly, is to write the assignment, the prompt. You may think that you should do that first and then write a rubric for the assignment, but remember, we're assessing learning outcomes, not an assignment. And what I found out is that if you start with the prompt, you tend to write what's called a task-specific rubric, which is only evaluating how well students can do that one specific assignment and not the more general learning outcomes we want them to develop, like critical thinking or written communication skills, problem solving, information literacy. So let me go back. I'm going to shrink one of the boxes I've got on my screen so I can see the whole screen myself that way. And let's start with the first step, which is listing on the left column the traits of the learning outcomes that you want. This is, again, the rubric that I used for writing. So you can see on the left column, I had 8 categories for 8 traits of good writing. I've heard those things called traits, characteristics. I don't care what word. Again, there's no consensus on what the right word is. I like traits just because it's an easy word. They actually fall, I figured out as I went through my 7 versions of this rubric, that they only fall into about 5 categories. One is the focus, meaning, is there a clear purpose? Do they know who the audience is? Do they understand the traits of this paper, like length? Then organization is another important aspect of good writing. Overall organization of the paper, and then also paragraph structure. I found students could do one and not the other. Then there's the content and the reasoning in the paper, and that's where, even though this is supposedly assessing writing, you can't assess writing without getting into a bit of critical thinking, and that's what we're getting in here with the reasoning. Then there's the style and the expression, things like sentence structure, tone, word choice. What I put separately was next to the bottom is a trait called wordiness. On the first day of class, I asked students to help me write this rubric simply by brainstorming what are the traits of good writing. And that the trait they came up with that I hadn't thought of was, they said good writing is concise. And I thought, boy, the world would be a much different place if all of us really tried to be as concise as possible with our writing. So I added that in as a trait. And then finally, of course, grammar and mechanics. Now, what are the characteristics here? First of all, these are characteristics of the learning outcome, written communication, and also as kind of getting at critical thinking there, not the assignment. I've seen rubrics that where they list opening paragraph, second paragraph, third paragraph, fourth paragraph, concluding paragraph. No, that's task specific. These are traits of the learning outcome. Also, it's really easy to come up with a rubric that has 15 traits, especially when you're getting really big papers and projects towards the end of a program. You have to focus on what's essential. And one of my rules for a rubric is if you print it out, it should fit on one piece of paper and without teeny tiny font. I mean, I know this font isn't huge, but I've seen rubrics where it is literally unreadable getting it onto one page. Also, I try to use language that is understandable to the students. And remember, I'm dealing with beginning students here. So for instance, I didn't use some of the English writing jargon that some people use that I don't even understand myself. I really tried to minimize jargon there. Something I didn't put here, but you may have noticed it on the theater rubric, is you can put in a fairly fuzzy trait. You can put in something like effort or overall impact. That was something I had on the theater rubric because you can do all the technical aspects of a play correctly and not necessarily have it come together into a cohesive whole. That's also true for papers. That's also true for a lot of projects. But what's not included here are extraneous traits. I've seen a lot of rubrics that for a paper may include, was the paper turned in on time? If it's presentations, did the student attend everybody else's presentation? Those are completely different learning outcomes. In fact, I call them professionalism. Now, if you want to assess professionalism, fine, build that in, but make that one of your learning outcomes. So the rubric should only assess the important learning outcomes that are the purpose of the assignment, nothing else. So let me jump ahead to the second, I'm sorry, this slide just lists all the things that I read to you about the traits, characteristics of effective traits. Now, second step is labeling all the categories across the top, the performance levels. And here's what I learned in my lit review. You need more than 2 performance levels, more than 2 columns, because if you only have 2, you really have a checklist. You're saying something is either present or not present. So you need at least 3 levels in a rubric. And those 3 levels I have in the bright white font here. You need exemplary work if you're grading what we would call A work. You obviously need a column for failing work. You might call it unsatisfactory. And then the most important one is the one in the middle that I call minimally adequate, passing work. It might be a C or a C- or a D, but the kind where even though it's not that great, it's good enough to be judged passing work. Those are the 3 that you definitely need. One thing that the experts were unanimous on is you shouldn't have more than 5 columns, because if you get into 6 or more columns, you start splitting hairs. You're not going to consistently distinguish between a rating of 3 and a rating of 4. So they all agreed no more than 5. The 5 that I see more often is there's often a pretty big gap between minimally adequate work and terrific work. And so a very good column is something we usually add. Then especially faculty at community colleges and other open admission colleges that are teaching beginning students have told me that there's also kind of a big gap between failing work and minimally adequate. The students need to know that even though they're not yet at passing work, they're almost there. So they like to have that extra column there. But 4 or 5 columns should be plenty for most people. Okay, the next step, the fun one, filling in all the boxes. This was where my world got rocked, because before I did this lit review, I've obviously looked at tons of rubrics, and I had sort of an instinct about, I like these rubrics, I don't like that rubric. But it was, I had not characterized myself quite as clearly why I thought some rubrics were good and others weren't. And here's why. First of all, just like I said for that traits column, the whole rubric should have vocabulary that beginning students understand. You want every student, and remember, even if you're assessing program outcomes, you shouldn't be using a rubric that students don't see. Whatever assignment you're looking at, they should get the rubric with the assignment and they should understand it. So that means every box needs to be brief. You need to use very simple language, very clear language, and keep it really jargon free. Let me give you an example. And this is one of the steps to equity, is minimizing the jargon. I'll give you a real simple example that I've encountered right now. It's not really a rubric, but ever since the pandemic, I've been doing online exercise classes. I hate exercise. I've never been into sports. And the instructors are great, but they keep using terms that I don't understand and don't explain them. Like they mentioned my glutes. I'm embarrassed to say, I have no idea which muscles are my glutes. So if they say, to focus on your glutes, I have no idea what they're talking about. So you have to think, we all know the language of our discipline really well. We have to remember, if we're working with entering students, there's a lot of words that are second nature to us that they may not understand. You want to keep them out of the rubric. Every student, no matter how much they're struggling, deserves to know what their expectations are. Here was the next thing that rocked my world. All of those boxes should only state observable behaviors. They should not be using subjective terms, evaluative terms, value-based terms. All the words that I have here in these bubbles are words that you have to use judgment on, and they're therefore not clear. You ask two different people what proficient is, you're going to get two different opinions. You ask two different people what appropriate is or adequate is, you're going to get two different opinions. You want to take opinions out of a rubric, and the way to do that is to put in real clear observable behaviors. Let me give you an example. This is probably the worst rubric I've ever seen in my life. So I love to share it as an example, because whatever rubrics you're dealing with or working on, they've got to be better than this one. But look at this. Lab design, look at insight on the bottom. None, little, adequate, excellent. Let's say that somebody gets a mark that they have adequate insight. They have no clue what to do to demonstrate excellent insight. That's why one of the experts that I read was Sally Andrade, and she had a quote about this that I really love. The rubric, when you score it and give it back to the students, the descriptions in the box should give students concrete ways to improve their shortcomings. So that adequate box needs to be replaced by a description of what is considered adequate insight. How would you know it when you see it? And boy, does that start interesting conversations among faculty, but really good discussions. That's what we're all about. Now, in contrast, let me pull up here a couple of lines from my rubric from writing. Mostly, this is much clearer than that last rubric. There are some fuzzy terms here, and I've gone ahead and highlighted them in red for you. Who's to say what is a somewhat interesting paper as opposed to a very interesting paper or a somewhat dull paper? What does it mean to not overly distract the reader? But one of the things another quote that I got from my lit review was that if you have overly rigid descriptions, you end up focusing on the trivial rather than the essential. So you want to minimize those value-laden terms, but you don't try to eliminate them completely, because you're going to end up having, again, focusing on the trivial rather than the essential. The line that I have here for grammar and mechanics is a really good example, because I've seen rubrics that say that excellent work has no errors, Very good has 1 to 5 errors. Adequate has 6 to 10 errors. Well, if you have that in the rubric, first of all, you have to go through and count all the darn errors, which is the most tedious task I can think of. And then when you're not distinguishing between an omitted comma that really doesn't make much difference versus a grammar or mechanics error that's so serious that you read this and say, I really can't understand this. There's something missing here. So I like the language here instead that, excellent work is impeccable. Very good is virtually no errors, but you have a couple of typos. It's not going to destroy your life. Adequate is substantially free. And then I really like the line about errors do not impede meaning or overly distract the reader. I still think that's very clear to students. If you have 2 faculty using the same rubric, they may not come to exactly the same conclusion, but I think it's good enough. Assessment is not perfect. We're not going to get it perfect. We just want to do a better job than we would do without rubrics, and this would help you be more consistent. Okay, are you ready for my next big light bulb that came on with my lit review? I will confess that before I did my lit review, when I wrote my own rubrics, I would start out by filling in the A or excellent or outstanding column. That's really easy. That's our pipe dream of everything we'd love to see in student work. Then I would fill in the failing column. That's really easy. That's just one description of miserable work, one line after the next. And then I would fill in all the boxes in between to create a continuum. Absolutely wrong. The most important column, and the one you want to fill in first, is that minimally adequate column, the one that represents minimally adequate or passing work. It describes not great work, but the student is doing at least well enough that they would succeed in later studies. So for example, for first year writing, they're not brilliant writers, but they're writing well enough that they will do decent work in later writing in later classes. Critical thinking or information literacy, again, not great work. They're making some errors here and there, but it's at least good enough that they'll be able to do, decently on their capstone paper. And here's the thing, when they get out in the workforce, you wouldn't be embarrassed. I read a whole book on setting standards, and the whole book basically distilled down to this. What goes in that minimal column, imagine that you had a student that got all scores in that minimally adequate column. And later somebody found out that you let that student pass the course or graduate from the program with all minimally adequate work, not failing, but nothing better than minimally adequate. Would you be embarrassed if somebody found out that that student passed your course or graduated from your program? That's the best way to figure out what goes into that column. And that was probably the biggest light bulb that came on for me. And that is also the hardest column. And many of you are faculty or have been faculty, and that the hardest grades are deciding whether a student passes or fails. Whether they get an A or a B, it's probably not going to change their lives. But whether they pass or fail a course or graduate or not, that's a huge weighty decision. It's best to tackle that column right away and then spread up to the A column and down to the failing column. So we have filled in the boxes, and now we're ready to actually write the assignment that accompanies the prompt. Remember, as I explained at the beginning, you first want to have a sense of what you're looking for, and then write the assignment so that you elicit from students what you're looking for. And here was, I think you're already figuring out that I read like really, really simple models. Marianne Winklemas has a model for creating great learning activities or great assignments that has it's so simple. I just love it to death. What she says is that great learning activities or assignments have 3 transparent traits that connect to each other. The first one is every assignment should have a clear purpose, which means it should have clear learning outcomes. Everything you do, you should be able to connect. And as we all talk about, it should be connected to course learning outcomes and either program or gen ed learning outcomes also. Then there's the task. the assignment, and the jargon word that assessment people use for it is the instructions that you give students. It's called a prompt because you're prompting them to give you something. And then the grading or evaluation criteria, which is the rubric. So all three of those should connect to each other. And when she says that they should be transparent, that means that the student should understand all three and see the connections about them. And the reasoning for it, and this is from two of my other favorite assessment people, Barbara Walford and Virginia Anderson. You want to spend more time giving the assignment and guiding students as they complete it, because then they will do better work. And then we spend less time grading it or assessing it, because again, as we all know, great work is really, really easy to assess. The C work and D work is the stuff that really takes a lot of time and a lot of thought. So it means coming up with pretty detailed instructions on what you want students to do in the assignment, trying to make it as clear as possible. You see how we're doing with time. This is great. I have just a couple more slides, and we're going to have almost a half hour to talk about all of this and get your ideas. What I want to share now are, I have for you 10 practical suggestions for equitable rubrics. And some of these you will recognize. They're things I've already suggested, but I want to here highlight that they're important to making the rubrics equitable. The first one, simply recognize that nobody is impartial. We all bring our own unique background and frankly biases into what we're doing. For example, if nobody does this anymore, but if you did old-fashioned blue book exams, it's so easy to be biased against poor handwriting. You know, if you have close to illegible handwriting, you're going to get frustrated, and it may be really easy to miss that, well, the handwriting may be bad, but there are really good ideas here. With students doing things online, a written assignment that's full of grammatical errors or that hasn't followed the instructions may blind us to the fact that, again, there's really good ideas here. So recognize that even though we try really, really hard to be fair, none of us is ever absolutely 100% impartial. Second, a lot of colleges have an institutional learning goal along the line of understanding and respecting the perspectives of people different from yourself. That's something we all need to not just adopt as an institutional learning outcome, but personally accept as something that we're all trying to work on. I'll give you a little tip on this that has really helped me. And let me move from that actually to the third one. Learn about your students' cultures. I have actually traveled, I've done workshops and consulting with colleges around the world. In fact, in my email inbox right now, I'm working with a college in Peru, one in Ireland, and one in Saipan near Guam in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When I'm working with a college in another country, or if I'm working with a college in a part of the United States that's different from my experience, for example, a tribal college, a historically Black college. One of the things that I do a Google search on is business etiquette for whatever culture I'm dealing with. And even though I'm not, you know, sitting down and doing a deal with people, it really has a lot of very practical suggestions. For instance, when I went to the Middle East, one of the things I learned is people there, family is really, really important. And one of the things that you do to be friendly is to ask people about their families. Here, we don't usually do that. It's considered too personal. But then also, don't be surprised if the answer only talks about men in the family and not about the women. Don't be shy about asking your students for help understanding their cultural backgrounds. The college that I'm working with in Saipan, if you Google business etiquette for Saipan, trust me, nothing's going to show up. It's a teeny little country. I asked the people I'm working with, tell me about the culture there. Tell me about, you know, how do workshops go there? How do people work together? Similarly, ask your students for help understanding their cultural backgrounds that are difficult that they're outside your normal realm of responsibility. Another thing, and this is one of the things I said before, but it's so important for equity, match your assessments to your learning goals and your objectives. Focus your rubrics on course objectives, program learning outcomes, not the specific task and the prompt. That really gets everybody focused on the same thing. Here's another example. A lot of us factor in whether an assignment is turned in late. And yeah, we want to help students learn to do things on time because that's something that employers will expect. But one of the things I've learned over the years is timeliness is valued differently in different cultures. So really think, if somebody turns this in an hour late, how important is that? How much should that be part of the evaluation process? If it's a really important learning outcome, if you're preparing students for a career where timeliness is really important, then make that a big emphasis, make that an important learning outcome. But otherwise, think about that. Next thing, I've said this already, but again, this is so important to equity. You want to write everything you give students, your learning outcomes, your rubrics, the assignments, and feedback, always using simple, clear vocabulary that entry-level students can understand, including, and also students for whom English is not their primary language. If there are terms that may be unfamiliar, like with me and my story about a glute, explain to them what the term is, and remind them about it over and over again, especially beginning students. Another thing I've learned is involve students from a variety of backgrounds and get them to help articulate your learning outcomes, whether they be course outcomes, program outcomes, gen ed outcomes, institutional outcomes. Get them involved in designing rubrics. Get them involved in developing the assignments. And again, make sure it's people from different backgrounds. Not every class is able to do all of these right from the get-go, but they can certainly, like I told you, well, first thing I did, first day of class for first year writing, was have them brainstorm what are the traits of good writing. That's the kind of thing everybody can get involved in. But one of the keys is make sure that all the voices in your class are heard and not just the majority. Another thing that I've learned, because I've worked with a lot of colleges where most of the students I know English as a second language, and it's harder for them to express what they've learned through writing and speaking than it is for native English speakers. So think about, do you really need to assess critical thinking through a writing assignment? Could students do a PowerPoint presentation instead? Could they do a visual, an infographic that would show their information literacy skills? I've actually known faculty who have done that. Get involved in more visuals rather than writing or speaking. That's fair to ESL students. I also encourage you to assess writing only in courses and programs where writing is a course objective or a program learning outcome or gen ed learning outcome. And then, because it is an important outcome, you've given students lots of practice and feedback on writing in your discipline. I actually think writing in a discipline should be a learning outcome of every program, but then it needs to be embedded in a lot of courses. And sometimes faculty need professional development in how to teach writing. They may say, I'm a computer scientist, I never learned how to write. I'm a biologist, I never learned how to teach writing. Good, teach them how to teach writing, how to give feedback, because I do think it's important for every student to learn how to write in the language and style of the discipline. Two last suggestions. For some students, encouraging them with a can-do attitude really makes a difference. Some are self-motivated, they don't care how you feel about them. But for a lot of others, if you take them, not only take a personal interest, but keep reiterating that you can do this. I know it's hard, but I know you can do it. That really makes a difference with some students. And then finally, commit to using your assessment results to improving learning for all students, not just the majority or the plurality. So that often means doing breakdowns by gender, by racial ethnic status, by age, something like, whatever data you have available, parsing the data down. Now, sometimes you have very, very small numbers where there's just not enough to look at to draw a conclusion. But if 20% of your students are African American and you have a pretty big program, that may be enough that you can, do a breakdown and make sure that they're doing as well as everybody else is doing. Just don't draw too many conclusions from the overall results. Okay, I've got, here are the sources that I used for these slides. The top one is that rubric development chapter that I wrote that this is based on. The book is pretty expensive, so I don't recommend running out and buying it. See if you can get it through interlibrary loan. I summarized a lot of what I learned in the 3rd edition of my book, Assessing Student Learning, which is a lot more affordable. And then out of all the experts that I read, the one that really convinced me to mend my ways was Susan Brookhart. And this is the book. It's written for K-12, but it really applies to higher education. I used to say that rubrics have no rules. She convinced me that yes, rubrics do have rules, like using those observable behavioral terms, starting with the minimally adequate column, things like that. So with that, let me stop the share because then I'll be able to see most of you. And let me go through the comments first, and then I'll throw it open for anybody else who wants to say anything. Fiona, oh, hi, Fiona. We have worked together before. Would you consider a rubric something that provides feedback to the student about their performance against what is expected and provides data for assessment of extent of student learning? Ideally, I'm so sensitive to the fact that everybody is so busy and so overwhelmed. And the idea of having one rubric for grading and another one for assessing program outcomes or gen ed outcomes really goes against my grain, because faculty should be focusing on program or gen ed outcomes. Maybe at an introductory level, but if they're not, what are they grading students on, and why aren't they focusing on program outcomes? Now, what I could see is having sort of a split rubric, because I know, the rubric that I showed you that I used for writing, I actually left off one line at the bottom. My students were writing well enough that halfway through the semester, I thought, they're ready to do a library research paper and learn how to cite literature. So the last 2 papers I assigned them, one they learned APA style and the other they learned MLA style. That was not in the learning outcomes for the course that I was teaching. That was something I added on myself. And that was one last line at the bottom of my rubric. So I have no problem saying the top half of the rubric are the program or gen ed outcomes. The bottom half are things that each individual faculty member wants to add on. That's fine with me. Fiona also asked about weighting of traits. If you're using rubrics to assess program outcomes, weighting is not really relevant, because the way you determine how well students have achieved the outcome is to look at how well they've achieved each trait. There's really not much sense of coming up with an overall score. You really want to look at how they're doing on each trait. That's where the usable, actionable information is on what students most need to work on to improve their achievement of the outcome. If you're using it to assign a grade, actually the workshop I'm doing for Ireland asked this. A lot of them do weighting. I initially, actually, when I first started using rubrics, I did weight them. Some categories had a maximum of 10 points, some had a maximum of 20 points. I found that it was a lot more math for me, and it didn't change their final grades. So I would say, let's, try it. try making one trait worth a maximum of 10 points, another one a maximum of 20 points, spread the points out down the columns, but then figure the grades and see, is it really changing their grades? And if it's not, get rid of it. And that's what I did. And the cool thing is with that rubric, I could just eyeball and figure out what their grade was. I didn't have to get into complicated math. Amy asked, do you use the AAC and U value rubrics to inform rubric developments? Those value rubrics are great. I really applaud AAC and U for taking the initiative, because before they were developed, so many faculty, especially in gen ed and liberal arts, said, I don't know how to assess ethical reasoning. I don't know how to assess civic engagement. And then they would even say, and it can't be done. Well, AAC and U proved them wrong by developing pretty good rubrics, but they were developed only to kick off conversation. And what worries me is a college adopting the value rubrics wholesale to assess, say, gen ed outcomes, because your students and your programs and your students' needs are distinct. So you should come up with your own rubric, but absolutely use those value rubrics to kick off the conversation. I'll also say now that the value rubrics were developed, boy, I bet about 15 years ago. They're due for an update. I look at them now, there's a lot of overlap among them. For example, they have a critical thinking rubric and a problem solving rubric and a scientific reasoning rubric. There's a lot of overlap among them. So you might look at them and kind of blend them on and off to come up with a rubric that you're really happy with. Enrique said, does passing ensure learning? It should, but remember that when we do these assessments, we're usually only looking at one sample of work. So it may be that this one assignment is the only topic that students are really comfortable, that a student is really comfortable with, and they kind of, fake their way through. But if you have really good assignments and you use rubrics repeatedly, yeah, the key thing is, in that passing column, make it appropriately rigorous. Make it so that if students score at that level, you're not embarrassed of them. Now, let me take though what you're saying, Enrique, and flip it another way. You may have some students who are brilliant, went to good high schools, and come into college already writing as well as we would like some students by the end of their sophomore year or even the end of their senior year. They're not going to show a lot of growth. Their first paper is going to be an A, their last paper will be an A. Did they learn anything in your course? I don't know. That's why I'm glad to see more opportunities for some appropriately qualified students to take college level work while they're still in high school and come with credits. I don't like students sitting through a class where they already know about it. So when you say, does passing ensure learning? Maybe not in this course. Maybe they already came in with those skills. Amy had another question. In your view, is the minimally adequate a 3 or 2 on a 4-point scale? I think of 3 as proficient, which could be the same as minimally adequate. Maybe proficient is a higher level. One thing I learned, Amy, in this lit review was there was no consensus among the experts on how to label those columns. And in fact, this college I'm working with in Ireland, some people use competent, some people use proficient, some use satisfactory. There's another one. Some use different words to label different columns, and I couldn't tell which one was the minimally passing one. That's a question I'm going to have for them. I'm doing their workshop next week. And that's where I don't worry about numbers and I don't worry about labels. What's important is what goes in the box and what each one means. You don't have to use the phrase minimally adequate. I use that because I think it's clear. But you need to come up with some term that you and your colleagues represent. This is minimal work that we consider satisfactory, adequate, whatever. Dawn has a great question. What about expected performance for the class? E.g., 75% met the outcome. That is a whole different conversation, and I'm going to give a really mean answer. And let me go back to my writing course. I actually set a grading standard in my course that if you were going to pass the assignment, you had to get at least a C on every trait, because otherwise you could have a student who got A's on almost everything but failed on grammar. Now, should I be passing a student who's got failing grammar? I was really uncomfortable with that. They were not prepared for what came next. So I told my students, and I made this very clear, you have to get a C in every column to pass the assignment. Now, if they failed at any column, since I'm a nice person, I would give them 24 hours to patch up the paper and get back to me. And every student I had then passed the paper, and they all did end up passing. But you really have to think, if only 75% of your students meet that minimally adequate level, that means a quarter of your students are doing inadequate performance. They're not prepared for what comes next. If it's gen ed courses, they're not prepared for junior and senior level courses. If it's a senior capstone, they're not ready for the workforce. Are you really comfortable letting a quarter of your students go through with inadequate writing skills or critical thinking or information literacy skills? What does that mean for them? I don't like to set a standard of 100%, because there could always be those students, like somebody who was sick or had a fight with their boyfriend the night before the assignment was due. But it should be like 90, 95%. I once worked with a pharmacy program, and their practice was every week, every student got tested, and you had to get a 95% to pass. And if you didn't get 95%, you had like maybe 1 or 2 more times to retake the test. And if you still couldn't pass, you failed the course. That sounds really draconian, but I thought, would you want your prescription filled by a pharmacist who does it correctly only 75% of the time? I don't think so. So would you want your taxes done by an accountant who does them correctly only 75% of the time? So I've become, pretty stringent about that in my thinking. Fiona says LMS software, learning management software, has rubric development tools that help with the math calculations. Yes, that's right. I work with all kinds of colleges, including really, really poor colleges that do not have LMS. So I tend to be real basic in my advice and give advice that everybody can use. Mena says, can you give us good resources on how to calibrate for high inter-rater reliability? No, because I don't really think we should worry about inter-rater reliability. Barbara Wright, another assessment expert who was originally a German professor, said something years ago that has always stayed with me. And she doesn't remember saying this, so I'm extra careful to give her credit for it. She said, I worry that we're sacrificing validity on the altar of reliability. Let me give you an example, and a really stupid example. Let's say that you are assessing students' math skills with an essay test. Well, you know that because of language, you could have students that are really good at math skills, are not good at expressing themselves in writing, will do terribly on the essay exam, even though they know the math skills. So that is not a valid essay exam for us. That's not a valid assessment for math skills. You can calculate all the inter-rater reliability you want to on that essay and get really high inter-rater reliabilities, and it's still a garbage assessment because it's not assessing what we really want. So what I'd really like people to focus on is make sure that every assessment has all the traits we've been talking about here, being super clear, being all those principles about being fair. You want to make sure that it really focuses on your learning outcomes very clearly. That's content validity. You also want to make sure that it generates data that is really useful to you and your colleagues in understanding and improving student learning. That's what we call consequential validity or pedagogical validity. That's far more important than inter-rater reliability. there's another book, and I'm having a brain freeze. I'm from the East Coast, so it's almost dinner time for me. So my brain is starting to collapse. And dang, I'm looking over here because you can't see it, but my bookshelf is over here. I'm going to remember it as soon as this session is over. But a guy in business wrote a book called How to Assess Anything, and you can find it on Amazon. That was how I found it. And he was talking from a business perspective about assessing fuzzy things in business that are a lot like assessing student learning. Another book that really, really opened my eyes. And one of the things he said is, we're not trying to take perfect measurements. Every day, and I'm taking his comment and applying it to us, every day, you and your colleagues are making decisions about student learning. You know, what they're learning, what they're not learning, what to do differently with teaching and curricular design. You're making this decision based on imperfect and incomplete information. The whole idea with assessment is not to make perfect decisions, but simply to make better decisions than what we would be making without rubric data or assessment data. So I don't worry about integrated reliability. I think you should take steps when you're developing the rubric to make sure everybody seems to have a good, common understanding. Maybe do a check once in a while to make sure the scores aren't wildly different. But I don't like to focus. I think you're focusing on the wrong thing. Okay. I got a very nice comment from Fiona. Thank you very much in chat. That ends, I think, what is in chat. So, and we still got about 4 more minutes to this session. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can either unmute your mic or add it into chat. Also, not just questions, but you guys have been using rubrics. You may have ideas above and beyond what I've shared with you, and I'd love to hear them. Okay, and at this point, I always say I've either done a brilliant job or I have completely lost you all. So hope I haven't lost you all. Hope I didn't scare you away. I really went on a bandwagon about iterative reliability. Hope I didn't scare you away. Yeah, there are some things I feel really passionate about. Okay, I don't know if Jarek is still on. I saw him poking in quickly, but I will send a PDF of the slides to Jarek.
Yes. Thank you, Linda. It's always a pleasure to have you. I'm just, I'm sorry, but I'm driving at this point. So but I've been listening to you all this time, and I tell you, I'm just always impressed, and I appreciate you did say more than once in your talk that your thinking has changed in the recent months. Let's just see, since COVID and whatnot. You stopped by at our Friday SLO talk. So again, I'm just so impressed by the value that you're bringing to these events. And I think that, again, the equity issues are coming up, the value rubrics you discussed, and really paying attention to behavior. I think that cannot possibly be, missed here, because that's what we have at our disposal, right? We can only look at what it is that students learn by observing them. What else is there? So we cannot, we don't have probes to reach into their minds, what kind of an experience they've had. It's only what it is that they do as a result of our teaching. And that's what your tools will provide, this type of assessment. So again, I'm just so very grateful for your being here and sharing those insights. It's just absolutely fantastic to always have you. So thank you very much for sharing, and we'll certainly stay in touch.
Okay. Thank you all for participating. It was great to see all of you. Great to see some familiar faces and a lot of new faces. This is a fabulous symposium, so I hope you continue to enjoy it. Thanks a lot, and have a good evening, good afternoon.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.